enslaved.org.
Hi, everybody. I'm Crystal Haynes. Tonight on Greater Boston, what kind of role does mental health play in preventing shootings like the one in Lewiston, Maine? I'll talk to a clinical and forensic psychologist about the warning signs, stigma, and how mass shooting survivors can start to pick up the pieces. Then, for thousands of people fleeing slavery, the so-called Underground Railroad ran through the Atlantic Ocean. Plus, an author and researcher joins us on some of his favorite New England haunts of the paranormal variety. The manhunt is over. All of the victims have been identified, and now the people of Lewiston, Maine are beginning to pick up the pieces after a gunman murdered 18 people in a bar and bowling alley last week in the deadliest mass shooting in the U.S. so far this year. As families and friends begin to bury their loved ones who range from 76 to 14 years old, police, public officials, and advocates are taking a look at what led up to this shooting and what could have been done to prevent it, and reported mental health struggles of the suspected gunman and Army reservist have come into play here. The suspect, who we're choosing not to name, was sent to the hospital for a couple of weeks of inpatient psychiatric treatment after he made alarming statements about his Army Reserve unit. That's according to the Washington Post, who also reported that the gunman had described hearing voices in recent months. So what do these insights mean for preventing future massacres? And what about the vast majorities of Americans who suffer from mental illness who pose no threat of violence? Well, to help us break all of this down, and we know it's a complicated subject, is Susan Lewis, a clinical and forensic psychologist, attorney, and author. Susan, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
So you've been doing this work, and as you saw what played out in Lewiston, what went through your mind?
Well, it was horrible. No question about it. I think that some of the theories that they began with in terms of this individual having a mental illness may have been mistaken. Mental illness is kind of a catch-all. It's kind of like cancer. But mental illness is really something that's very specific. The individual that was involved in the shooting, I believe, was in his 40s. There was some conversation that he was hearing voices and that he had been hospitalized. And the reality is, at that particular age, it's very unusual for someone to have a psychotic break, which is when someone would hear voices, unless there's something going on in terms of his brain or something like that. So I think that the media has been looking very hard, as it always does, to try and figure out why an individual would do something like that. And of course, the end is always that there's a mental illness.
Well, we know that, his family thought that something was going on. They reported that he had been hearing voices, had some paranoid behavior. They apparently reported it to the police and to this Army Reserve unit and felt like not much was being done there. There was a conversation around whether or not he actually had treatment this past summer. There's some conflict, where we had, contradictory reports on that specifically. So if it wasn't this mental illness piece, and you mentioned that oftentimes these things get mischaracterized, what is it normally in your experience? And of course, you obviously don't have access to this man's medical records. We understand that.
That's true. I think that mental illness has become a catch-all phrase. And it is really something that's very specific. And severe and persistent mental illness is based on a particular diagnostic and statistical manual. And so to say that he was hearing voices and that people were concerned about him, there's no question that that's alarming. On the other hand, that's not necessarily anything predictive of the violence that we have seen most recently. It is not uncommon for individuals to seek out mental health care, and the system really is set up at this time not to be able to meet the demands that are necessary of individuals that suffer from mental illness. And often what happens is, particularly in hospitals, people get held for 72 hours and discharged afterwards. There isn't any place for people that are mentally ill, and they get discharged to the street. Doesn't sound like that was the case with this gentleman, but clearly there was something going on, and he needed some kind of treatment that probably was for an extended period of time, and that was not available or it wasn't given to him, which is a tragedy.
We see the profile of these gunmen in the mass shootings that we've seen in the last few years, and it seems like it's a white male. There's some sort of background that means he's isolated. As you think about this as an attorney, as someone who's also a psychologist and has written about this topic, I mean, when you are profiling these folks, is it the person or is it the guns? Because oftentimes the conversation is around this person has the archetype for a mass shooting, and so therefore mass shootings occur, and it's not necessarily the gun. Do you think that's conflated in this conversation?
Well, I think that there are many people that have grown up in environments that are not conducive to having healthy lifestyles. Childhood sexual abuse, beatings, poverty. These individuals don't have a pillow to put their heads on and feel safe. Many of them do not become mass murderers, which I think is really important. And so I think that we can't characterize these individuals and say, well, an individual that grows up in this kind of an environment has a propensity to be a mass killer. On the other hand, the guns that some of these individuals use are guns that are made for warfare. And I suspect, I don't know that this is true, but one of the reasons there was some difficulty in identifying the individuals was because the gun that this gentleman used was designed for war and to essentially destroy someone's being, which I believe it did. So I do believe that this level of use of guns, at least these guns, are out of control. They're not guns that should be sold on the market or anywhere else. They are used for warfare, period.
I'm always struck when we have these conversations and it is framed as someone who had a mental illness, whether that's true or not, that then there's not more resources put into mental health care, which seems like that's where we see the deficit, whether or not someone gets a sniper-style rifle and decides to kill 18 people.
Whether or not there is money in mental health care, I think the stigma of mental illness is nothing new. I think it's been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. Many of the patients that I've seen that are very, very ill are very ashamed that they have a diagnosis and that they have been referred to as mentally ill. And so there's a stigma attached to it. There's a stigma attached for individuals that want to be in individual therapy. You can imagine the stigma attached to someone that needs hospitalization. There are no long-term hospitals anymore. There's nothing in the community to help people. There's nothing in the United States that I know of that has been designed to really deal with those individuals who are really suffering over the long term from severe and persistent mental illness. It's a terrible, terrible tragedy.
That's for sure. And as we think of the folks in the town of Lewiston and how a community can recover, what kind of supports need to be put in place so that folks can feel some type of normalcy, whether that's next week or a year from now?
That's a wonderful question. We hear the politicians saying that the community will draw together and they will support each other. I hope that that's true, but I wouldn't be surprised if the majority of people in Lewiston, Maine, are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. And it would make some sense to bring in some mental health professionals to assist them with that. It's very difficult for them to heal on their own, and there are going to be long-term consequences for this, as there were in Sandy Hook, and there have been with their other mass shootings. It just doesn't go away because there's a community of people that draw it together, although that's certainly important. I don't think it's the most important. I think people's mental health is.
Yeah, I think about that, there was a playhouse there. There was, of course, the kids going to school and the community coming together. Do you think that what it is like maybe the federal government needs to step in and have these people, at least provide funds for access to mental health clinicians? Because we know that that's already a challenge.
That would be simply wonderful. Although we know the federal government doesn't move at lightning speed.
That's certainly right, especially when they're trying to get a House Speaker elected. Not to put light on this, but the other thought I also had is when you mentioned Sandy Hook, I've met so many Sandy Hook families and other folks who have experienced this type of traumatic event. If you were there, what advice would you give them?
If I were there, what advice would I give the survivors?
The survivors, yes.
Yeah. Well, I would encourage them to get mental health care. I probably would encourage them I think that group therapy can be very helpful. I would encourage them to share their feelings with each other and not be fooled by the politicians that say, oh, everything will be all right. Just draw it together at a community, that there's really a focus on assistance by the professionals that are trained to give it. That's what I would suggest.
Well, Susan Lewis, certainly that's so important right now. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Next up, the term Underground Railroad tends to paint a picture of an orderly, mapped-out system of travel, but the reality for people fleeing slavery in the United States was a lot more complicated than that. And as a local historian has learned, many weren't even traveling on solid ground. The new book, Sailing to Freedom, tracks the path of thousands of enslaved people who escaped to the North by sea. Well, that book's editor, UMass Dartmouth history professor Timothy Walker, joins me now, as does Christian Walks, the director of education and interpretation programs at the Museum of African American History. Thank you so much for you both being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Professor Walker, I would love to talk about what made you want to put this book together. Why do you think it's so important?
Well, I grew up in the Midwest in Ohio, where the Underground Railroad was almost exclusively a terrestrial story. But I moved out to Massachusetts to go to graduate school and then to work at UMass Dartmouth. And I also started working on some of the tall ships that sail up and down the East Coast as training vessels. So I became very interested in this maritime component. We ran a program about the Underground Railroad in New Bedford, Massachusetts, where I live. And it turns out that New Bedford was a very important terminus point where people escaping enslavement came to work and to live, where they could live in freedom. And we found out that an extraordinary number of them were arriving by water. And so we ran a National Endowment for the Humanities program about this, brought in experts from all over the East Coast. And it just became clear that this was a story about the Underground Railroad that was very little known, had not been studied very much. And we wanted to look into this. And the book grew out of that effort.
And Christian, why do you think this is part of the story of American slavery that hasn't been told?
And, there are many parts of the story that haven't been told. For many years, much of this work had to happen covertly. And so when you're thinking about people escaping and seeking refuge, many of these networks, whether they were on ground or all over the sea, they had to be kept in some sort of secrecy. And so I think part of the issue is going back in history and trying to read in between the lines many times to recuperate these stories that are oftentimes lost out of folks' need for security and secrecy in order to move throughout these networks to freedom.
And, Professor Walker, talk to me about the process in gathering up these stories, because we know that these accounts can be very difficult to track down and get.
Well, some of the best clues we have come from published narratives that were published after the Civil War, once slavery had been outlawed. And something like 70% of narratives published by persons who had escaped bondage into freedom, about 70% of them reference escaping by ship, by water along the eastern seaboard. And so that was a big important clue. And then another one is so-called runaway slave ads that owners of enslaved people would place in newspapers. They usually described the method by which they suspected their property had escaped. And so looking at those, it was clear that again and again and again, we find owners who are saying that my enslaved person escaped by water, by ship. And so with evidence like that, we started looking deeper and finding more and more stories about how people arrived to the North by water.
I think it was fascinating too in looking at your book and researching this topic is that after, crossing the Atlantic during the slave trade there, the folks would be willing to get back on a ship to their freedom.
Well, a lot of the people that we're talking about by the 1830s and 40s and 50s, the importation of enslaved people was illegal after 1808 in the United States. And so a lot of the people that we're talking about, they were working in waterfront capacities. They were working in maritime trades. They were intimately familiar with the water and with ships. And for them, it was a very natural thing to get aboard vessels that they normally were working on in port cities in the South. They would have opportunities that other people working inland in agricultural enslavement, people working inland would not have the opportunities to escape by water that port workers would. And so it was quite familiar to them to go. And in New Bedford, when they arrive in New Bedford, they are often working in the same kinds of trades and earning money as free laborers that they hadn't done when they were in the South as enslaved people.
Interesting. Christian, when we would cover new layers of African-American history, new stories like this, I imagine it's gratifying to be able to put it on display, show it, amplify work like Professor Walker's.
Absolutely. It is so important because oftentimes folks are leaving records, as with Professor Walker mentioned, through narratives, for example. And oftentimes you have to go and read between the lines of certain ads where they're trying to track down folks. But having a full story from the perspective of these people who are traveling and seeking refuge is important. And that's something that we strive to do at the museum, is bring attention to these stories by putting forth that Black voice in those seeking refuge and centering that for the public to understand the story.
And Christian, do you think that folks don't realize that rich history of working with ships, working in the maritime spaces at this time in history?
I think that is an undertold part of the journey from slavery to freedom. Many people aren't familiar with folks like Absalom Boston, who has deep connections to our site in Nantucket. He was the first Black captain of an all-Black crew and amassed a bunch of wealth through the whaling industry. And so this sort of maritime industry is understudied, I think, and not well understood in our public understanding.
Professor Walker, did anything surprise you as you were pulling together the research for this book?
I think the sheer numbers surprised me. We came to think of the maritime side of the Underground Railroad as being rightly thought of as really the other half of the story. Anyone escaping from the far South did it by water. Almost all overland escapes were relatively short escapes from states that were slave states bordering on a free state. But if you wanted to escape a very long distance, you almost had to do it by water. And once you're out to sea, 3 miles offshore, where there is no enforcement, you're in international waters, your pathway to escape is relatively safe. That wasn't true on land. On land, you had all kinds of impediments to your freedom, including slave patrols and things like that. So it was a much easier thing to do once you were aboard a ship to get to freedom. And ships traveled faster. On land, you would go maybe 20 miles a day. A ship could go 150, 180 miles in a day.
That's fascinating. We know of legends like Harriet Tubman on the Underground Railroad. Do you think that sort of allowed us to think of the actual, space or the Underground Railroad itself as being terrestrial only because there were these legends that were there? And if so, were there any similar that you uncovered in your research on the water?
Well, I think that most historians in the United States are not trained in maritime skills, so they don't use maritime archives, and we focus on the stories that we're familiar with, and so folks were very well aware of people escaping over land in Ohio and Indiana and in Pennsylvania, but they just weren't as familiar with those maritime stories until we started looking at them here in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and began to realize just how important they were. But there are numerous people whose stories sort of mirror the extraordinary courage of Harriet Tubman. And this is in no way to diminish the terrestrial story. It's very important. But we just want people to understand that the maritime side is at least as important and accounts for an enormous number of people escaping from enslavement in the U.S. South.
Absolutely, and certainly an extremely interesting read. We want to thank you both for your time, Professor Timothy Walker and Christian Walks. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And finally tonight, New England is known for a lot of things: brutal winters, clam chowder, a Dunkin' on just about every block. But what about ghosts? Home to some of the oldest cities in the country, there are bound to be a few things that go bump in the night. My guest would certainly know that. Paranormal researcher Tom D'Agostino has written more than a dozen books about ghost legends and folklore in New England, and he joins me now to share a few of them as spooky season actually comes to a close. And we were talking off air, Tom. It's a busy time for you, I imagine.
Oh, yes, very much so. Yeah, everybody wants us.
How'd you get into this?
I actually grew up in a haunted house, and when I was in college, I stayed in a house. It was my friend had bought it, and he was going to turn it over, and he said, "Hey, you want to stay the winter there? You're in college, and just all you got to do is take care of it." Well, I lasted about 6 days because every single night something really major was happening. And I couldn't study, couldn't sleep, couldn't study. Then I started studying the physical sciences, esoterical sciences, social sciences, everything, meteorology, just to see what or why this happens.
Well, I think that's so fascinating that your first reaction wasn't to run away and do something completely different. What do you think it is about your initial reaction when you realized you were living in a haunted space?
Well, for us, it always is unnerving. I mean, if you could be the most stout person in the world, but if someone sneaks up behind you and goes, you're going to jump. So when things started happening, at first I'm like, whoa. And then they just escalated. You'd hear someone run up the stairs and wind would blow by you, and that was it. And it'd be like, okay, this is like a little, it's a little too much to be able to sleep and study at the same time.
So we know that New England is home to some of the haunted places in the world, I imagine, and certainly in the country. Talk to me about some of the most haunted places you've been.
Okay. One of them is the Concord Colonial Inn. And it just happened to be rated #1 on a few lists as haunted in the country. We've had experiences there. In fact, last year we were doing a live TV segment for WBZ CBS, and the spirit box, which you hear things happen in real time, actually began talking to the reporter.
Oh, wow, that's incredible. Do you find that is it something about New England specifically that makes it more haunted than other places? I mean, certainly because, the way where settlers, I imagine there's a historical aspect to it.
Yes, New England is the oldest permanently settled, region in the country, and there was a lot of different strife. You had the wars, you had people starving, the winters, the harsh living conditions, wild animals. When they came here, the first settlers, They didn't bring houses. There were no construction companies waiting for them. They had to do with what they had. And of course, also being part of the glacial dump, you have a lot of underground streams and quartz crystals, which create a natural battery, which can also perpetuate these kind of hauntings.
Wow, that's incredible. So I know that you run a tour as well as writing all of these books and things like that. What are some of the things you show folks?
Oh, during the tours, we go to different haunted places, everything from places that were haunted since King Philip's War to haunted inns and taverns and vampires. New England is the vampire capital of the world. It just happens to be as well.
Wow, that's incredible. How is that? I think of, and maybe Mary Shelley is to blame for this, but I think of somewhere else, like Romania being the vampire capital of the world.
For over 100 years, hundreds, if not thousands of families were digging up their loved one thinking that there were vampires among them. Basically, they were dying of consumption or tuberculosis, and there was no known cure, so they turned to superstition. And they thought the good spirit of a family member was coming out of the grave and feeding on another family member.
Okay, so vampires and ghosts you can find on your tours.
Oh yeah. There's plenty of them.
That's incredible to me. So you've written 17 books, and you're talking ghost legends and things like that. What's your favorite story that you've told, or I guess maybe the spookiest? If we could use that barometer now that we're one day before Halloween.
One of the spookiest is a place called Ramtail Factory in Foster, Rhode Island. And it's not only still haunted, believe it or not, the remains of the factory and village are in the woods, and people can hike out to it. But it has that very romantic style ghost story too. Like the guy, he's a night watchman. He's he gets fired because he was an original partner, but he owed the factory money, and they throw him out of the partnership, and he threatens to kill himself, and they find him hanging from the bell rope. And shortly after that, the bell starts ringing. And then, they see his ghost starting up the whole mill and this kind of thing. And then later on, his ghost with the lantern, the old lantern, when he used to go from building to building, is seen to this day. And it's just one of those really cool, old-fashioned romantic haunts. But to this day, people still see it.
That's incredible. And I am thoroughly scared and going to look under my bed tonight. So thank you for that, Tom D'Agostino. Thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you very much. Quite a pleasure and an honor.
Well, that's it for tonight, but come right back here tomorrow. Rep. Justin Pearson, one of the Tennessee 3 who were expelled from the state legislature over gun control protests, will join me on the Lewiston shooting, his continued fight for gun laws, and winning back his seat in the legislature. That and more tomorrow at 7. Thank you so much for watching. Good night.